Our next speaker is Chris Millegan. Chris Millegan is a writer, researcher, and publisher whose father was in the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, Military Intelligence, G2, and later in the CIA, rising to branch chief, head of intelligence analysis for East Asia. His father told him things he didn't understand in the late 60s. These revelations led to over 30 years of research into the subjects of CIA drugs, clandestine operations, and secret societies. His publishing house, Trine Day, brought Anthony Sutton's America's Secret Establishment, an introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones, to a wider audience, published the book Expendable Elite by Lieutenant Colonel Dan Marvin, a tale of Special Forces commander and his tangles with the CIA. Trine Day's most recent release is Fleshing Out Skull and Bones. Trine Day also has the book Ambushed, Secrets of the Bush Family, the Stolen Presidency, 9/11 and 2004, coming out in April. Chris produced 2 CIA drug symposia in 2000 that brought together top researchers, whistleblowers, authors, and academicians in the field. He lives in a rural community outside Eugene, Oregon. Please welcome Chris Millegan.
Well, howdy do, and thank you very much. And I want to thank Carol for putting this on, and thank the people that helped her, because, you know, like the lady said, I've done some of these things, and they're a hard thing to pull off. And I appreciate her work, and I appreciate all of you folks coming out here to listen to us. And thank you. Well, I'm kind of a hippie, and you learn some things being a hippie, you know, learn about a couple things, and one thing, you know, the hippie philosophy kind of, it boils down to 2 things. Basically, respect your Mother Earth and your fellow brothers and sisters, and then to question authority. And that is what we are doing here today, is questioning authority. And generally, I can talk a lot, and I generally talk for a couple hours. So one thing I'm doing today is I'm kind of starting off at the end, because generally after I talk, people say, well, what can we do? What are we going to do? And, you know, Mr. Gandhi was an amazing fellow. And, you know, he basically got the British out of India. And one of the first things he did, you know, they told him that an Indian couldn't manufacture salt. An Indian had to buy the salt from the British, or who they told him to. Well, he said, what do you mean? And he organized a march, and they marched down to the ocean, and he got some salt water to come up and let it evaporate and made salt, you know. And these people, you know, that we're dealing with aren't going to leave out of an election, you know. They know all our hopes and our fears, and they play on our hopes and our fears. And I personally think, I've been looking at it a long time, and from Anthony Sutton, who's been looking at it a long time, he said, these people aren't going to get elected out. But their corruption is so outrageous that it won't last forever. And people see the corruption, and that's one reason why we're here. And how are we going to get rid of this corruption? My personal thing is I think that it's going to take nonviolence, peaceful demonstrations, because there are way more of us than there are of them. And we can take back our republic with pots and pans. And like he says there, he says, when I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love has always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time, they can seem invincible. But in the end, they always fall. Think on it. Always. Next slide. It'll come back at the end. God, man, and magic at Yale. That's basically what I speak about, and we aren't going to be able to get into all of this. Okay, the Order of Skull and Bones, mass psychology, propaganda, the Hegelian dialectic, and current events. Okay, there was a decision made by these people, okay, in the early 1900s, to go with the new scientific thing of propaganda and use propaganda and mass psychology on us people to move us in the direction that they wanted to use. And then they use the Hegelian dialectic, and they pay a lot of attention to the extremes, and they've created, well, I shouldn't say they've created, but they have tried to influence always the left and the right to try and control both sides to move history in the direction where they want to. When Hegel was talking about the dialectic, he was saying, well, this is kind of how history works. Well, these guys looked at that and they says, well, yeah, that's kind of true. That's kind of how history works. It goes to one extreme and then the other extreme and whatnot. So they started to create these extremes to play them against each other. Next slide. Skull and Bones. I mean, they are a secret society. They have been around officially as the Order of Skull and Bones since 1832, okay? That's generations. We are dealing with lies that were told before we were born. And one of the things that Skull and Bones did, one of the very first things they did, if you look at their membership list, you see a lot of teachers and a lot of reverends. And they took over our education system very, very early on. Brought us an education system that was developed in Prussia. The Prussians were very mad at the people because Napoleon beat them up in the early 1800s. And Johann Wolfgang Fichte, in his third address to the German people, says, we're going to take your children and we're going to teach them what and how and when to think. And they even took kids by bayonet point. And they took them to the schools, and they created 3 schools. They created the folk schools, they created the institutes for the helpers of the elites, and then the academies for the elites. And in the folk schools, what they found is if they took the classical education, which was kind of in around and everything kind of related, they says, well, if we just take the subjects apart, teach them for about an hour, put bells in between, sound familiar, we can create a false construct around people. And then by manipulating the extremes of that construct, we can continually move on through generations and dumb us down. Okay? And I mean, and they've been especially about our civic heritage, about what we are. I mean, they've been working very hard to convince us all we live in a democracy. We live in a democracy. Well, we don't. We live in a republic. And my rights come from God. They do not come from a piece of paper. They do not come from a vote of the people. And that piece of paper, that Constitution, limits the power of government. But they have, I'm 54 years old. I did not have a civics class. My older brother had a civics class, but they have continued to move it down. And then, seems like those are skulls and bones and whatnot. Now, where do you see that symbol? You see that symbol on bottles of poison. Why? Because it'll kill you. It's death. These guys are the brotherhood of death. Okay? When you look at like conspiracy literature, and I've spent my time looked at a lot of conspiracy literature, and one thing I want to tell people is caveat lector, be aware of what you read. And be especially aware of what you believe. Because I can show you a conspiracy book, blame it on these people, a whole bunch of different people. Because a conspiracy theory does not have to be true to have an effect. And they always denigrate conspiracy theories, but they're playing us with conspiracy theories all the time. Next slide. Well, there he is, Mr. George Bush, Judge George W. Bush. And, when these guys get asked about the Order of Skull and Bones, what do? Well, they either lie. George Bush, one time, he says, Skull and Bones? Well, it doesn't exist. It's so secret, it doesn't exist. Or they say the standard little line, oh, well, you know, it's just so secret, I can't talk about it.
You were both in Skull and Bones, the secret society.
It's so secret we can't talk about it. It's so secret we can't talk about it.
It's so secret we can't talk about it. Can't talk about it. Can't talk about it.
What does that mean for America? What does that mean for America?
You know, and not just George W. Bush, but next slide. Our Mr. John Kerry, you know, who is the Democratic nominee for president here, it sure looks like. And, you know, he says basically the same thing. You know, he says, well, they're just so secret I can't talk about it.
You both were members of Skull and Bones, a secret society at Yale. What does that tell us?
Not much, because it's a secret.
Well, my question is, where is their allegiance? Is their allegiance to this select little group, this elite group, or is their allegiance to our country? I don't see it. You know, John Kerry was on the Senate Intelligence Committee. He ran the narcotics trafficking hearings during the Iran-Contra. Officially, George H.W. Bush is out of the loop in Iran-Contra. I mean, we all know that he wasn't. There's tons of researchers that have found all kinds of stuff that says he was. But officially, George H.W. Bush was out of the loop. Officially, Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy. And officially, the CIA doesn't do drugs. And anybody who says differently, okay, I mean, it's amazing. I've been looking at this a long time, and so I run across these reporters who think they've run across the story of their life, and they have, and they think it's going to make their career. And it does, but not in the way they hope it to do. Basically, they don't work for a major daily newspaper anymore, and they got to deal with, you know, a hippie up in Oregon to try and get their books published and get out there. Because it's amazing what this country has been turned into, and they haven't even told us yet, you know. Next slide. That's my dad. And, you know, he was just my dad, you know. He didn't know much about it. He didn't talk, you know, about working for the CIA. I mean, I've got an older brother and an older sister. We would talk about it. My dad would never talk about it. He never talked about it, you know, at the dinner table or anything and whatnot. But when I started to become a hippie, growing my hair long and smoking a little marijuana, my dad, he was concerned about that. And, you know, and I, you know, I was a teenager and I knew it all anyway and whatnot. So it just didn't make much sense to me what my dad told me. I'm going to tell you what my dad told me, and I've told this story many times, but it really means a lot exactly what he said. And he said, first off, he asked me what I thought of the Vietnam War. And, you know, I was raised on John Wayne and World War II. All my uncles were in World War II. And I give a flip little answer to my dad. I say, we got a sack of hand grenades and some rice patties, and you go throw them and win it for the good guys wearing the white hats, you know. And he says we had to have a talk. And he waited a while till there was this gentleman from Nashville, Tennessee, from Vanderbilt, Dr. D.F. Fleming in town. And he said it was time to have that talk. And he took me in my little brother's room downstairs and sat me down, and he looked at me and he says, the Vietnam War is about drugs. There's these secret societies behind it. And I'm thinking, okay, the mafia. He's talking about the mafia, you know. And then he says, and communism's all a sham. These same secret societies are behind it. It's all a big game. And I'm thinking, gee, Dad, you're nuts. What are you talking about, you know? And then it comes in my, oh, you're having a drug talk with me. This is what's going on, you know? And I'm kind of waiting for him to say, you know, don't stop smoking pot and stuff and whatnot. Well, you know, so I'm kind of going on automatic pilot and they're listening and they're talking and they basically tell me that when Eisenhower had come aboard, he had asked for an assessment report about what was going on in the world. And my father, like the lady said, he'd been branch chief head of East Asia for research and analysis, was his last overt job with the CIA, and then he went covert for some years, and we'll get into that. And he was in G2 and OSS at the same time, and very few people were in that. And basically what that means is that you have two sets of books, because G2 is military intelligence, OSS is the executive branch intelligence. Well, they don't always tell each other everything they know and whatnot. And it was, they had to sheep-dip my dad to put him in G2 because MacArthur and General Willoughby didn't want him on the staff. And then after World War II, he also did a study of the Japanese use of heroin during the World War II and before that, and their use of it both as a political weapon and as a means of creating money. And so, you know, he told me these things, and I was sitting there, and I just didn't have no idea what he was talking about. And later on, we would have some arguments because I continued to smoke marijuana, and I didn't really see anything wrong with it. And in these arguments, what it got down to was he was very, very concerned about me getting hooked on heroin. And we had this one argument one time where basically he told me, he says, there's this plan to get all you kids here hooked on heroin. And I said, Dad, I says, you know, I really don't see it. I really don't care about heroin and whatnot. I just smoke a little pot now and then. And he didn't really see much difference between pot and heroin and whatnot. And he just kind of turned and spat out this thing. He says, you are just going to be making money for them. And the way he said them, I will just never forget, because it just had all this vitrifusion in it and whatnot. So, you know, I took what he said there and, you know, went on with my life. And I was looking into, the Kennedy assassination and whatnot, and was reading some things about that. And it said in there, in probably some girly magazine I was reading, a story about the Kennedy assassination, they were leading all the different theories. And in one of these things they said, well, maybe there's some people that say there was a secret society involvement with it. And that brought back this conversation that I had with my father. And so I started to look into it more. And I had a hard time finding out different information about it. And let's go on to the next slide here. This is a gentleman here. This is Colonel Lansdale. And if you've looked into conspiracy literature at all, Colonel Lansdale is a very interesting fellow. He was the prototype of two books, The Ugly American and The Other American. He was one of the first Americans to go into Vietnam after the French left. And one of the things that he did there very early on was he took over the Golden Triangle from the French, and he didn't just say, oh, well, we're here, we'd like to do it. There was actual shooting war between two Western intelligence agencies. It didn't happen very often. The French were running it with the Corsicans, and we brought in our own Corsicans and then brought in the Sicilians. Well, because my dad was an expert on the Philippines, and Lansdale worked in the Philippines and then worked in Vietnam, he relied on my dad for a lot of information and would work with him. Let's go on to the next slide. Lansdale used to come over to the family house. They're, you know, old-fashioned family. They used to have a guest book there, and people would come over and they'd sign it there. And so you can see Mr. Lansdale. He was at my parents' 10th wedding anniversary. I was probably sleeping or crying in the background. Who knows? Next slide. This is a picture of Colonel Lansdale in 1956 in Vietnam. And my father in 1956 told us kids that he was going to write a book called The Church in Southeast Asia, and dropped us off at our grandparents' house in Oregon and went off to Southeast Asia. And they spent a day in Vietnam and met with Colonel Lansdale. Well, you know, I didn't really put a lot of this stuff together until about 1988 when I ran across Anthony Sutton's book, Introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones. And my dad died in 1990, and I really didn't get to talk to him a lot about it, but I was talking to my mother one day because I was really interested in this trip that they did in 1956 because I was researching CIA drugs and different things, and they had gone to Chiang Mai, Thailand. And Chiang Mai, Thailand is the second largest city in Thailand now. It's grown a great deal. It has banks, all have branches there, and it's basically a heroin city built on heroin. And I was interested in how big Chiang Mai was in '56, and so I asked my mother, and she says, well, the biggest thing in Chiang Mai was the church. And she got out her picture book and was showing me these pictures of Chiang Mai. And then my mother said, she says, and you know, that's when I stopped believing everything that was in the newspapers. And I says, well, why, Mom? And she says, well, because when they were there in Chiang Mai, there was these big headlines in the newspaper and pictures and everything talking about this big battle in Vietnam right where they had been the day before. And she said, there was no battle there. And I kind of laughed, and I says, well, Mom, what do you know about Colonel Lansdale? And she said, well, he's a handsome, charming guy. I'm sure he was. And that's what she thought of him. I says, well, I kind of laughed, and I says, well, Mom, I says, we know from the historical record that Colonel Lansdale in the Philippines went out and did complete fake battles, sometimes complete with ketchup and whatnot. And so here, let's go to the next slide here. That's my mother, and she was either, you know, taking pictures or getting her picture took. And if you can see down here, guy at the short, that's Lansdale again, in you know, in the similar picture. And if you look at what my mother wrote on the side of the picture there, it says Eudora, that's my mother's name. Eudora out from Saigon with Colonel Lansdale and North Vietnamese military leaders. Okay, and what I'm trying to impress upon you is the games that these people play. Okay, they play us for games. Okay, and why do they have fake battles out in the middle of the jungle? Okay, why do they do that? Because they want people to choose sides. Because once you choose a side, you're much easier manipulated. Okay, and that's one of the reasons why they do that. And it's very interesting, you know, what this was done in the little city Troy, Vietnam, and this was in 1956, okay? And this was right after he took over the Golden Triangle. So they start fomenting a war. And then what happened? Well, we had a war, and going back to the assessment report that my dad talked about that they were doing for Vietnam, he told me, he says, and we think that they're playing out a lose scenario. And this was in the late 60s. My dad told me, he says, because, you know, in this assessment report, they say, well, if we back this faction, this is likely to happen, and blah, 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 blah. And he told me, he says, they're playing out a lose scenario there. And so Lansdale takes over the Golden Triangle, starts to have fake battles in there to create sides so that there can be a war. And then what do? They draft young men and send them to hell for a year, and then bring them back here. Well, gosh, do you think some of those young men in hell might get addicted to some cheap heroin that they're trying to sell them over there? And then they come back here, and they've got a ready-made market and people to deal it and stuff like that and create a market. You know, and I'm not saying drugs are bad or anything like that. I mean, they're just like anything. You know, guns aren't bad. It's a person who does something with it. And it's interesting in this little city where this happened. The next slide. It's the headquarters of Cao Dao, which is kind of a cult. It's they have a Saint Hugo, Victor Hugo, and whatnot like that. Next slide. And it's about poppies. It's about poppies. And Skull and Bones has been in the poppy business, okay, since they began. And the people who started Skull and Bones were in the poppy business before then. Okay? Opium became the largest commodity on the planet in the 1830s. Okay, these guys were making huge money. Okay, and they brought it here and set up the railroads and took a whole bunch of land. Okay, it's not by chance that Mr. Weyerhaeuser, who owns a lot of that land now, is also a member of the Order of Skull and Bones. I mean, it is just amazing. Next slide. This was a thing I put together for the CIA drug symposiums. And, you know, George W. Bush claims to have only been a member of the CIA for a year. And they named the building after him. You know, and most researchers, and I'll conclude with that, I strongly believe that he was in the CIA straight out of Yale. And there's lots of evidence to that. And one of his jobs was to coordinate the drug running and put it under a national security state. Okay, so they don't have to bring it in themselves. They can, you know, have some colonel tell some captain to tell some lieutenant to tell some, you know, colonel in private to do their dirty work for them. And then they work with the mob to sell the drugs, you know. I mean, the war on drugs has nothing to do with our health, our children, or anything like that. It has to do with keeping a black market in place so that these guys can sell drugs for 3 plants for more than the price of gold. And that is the reality of it. No ifs, ands, buts about it. These guys, you know, there's some games that they play. One of their big games, too, is war. You know, people out there probably seen the movie Skulls. And if you've noticed in there, one thing they do is they talk about war. It was always in the background in the pictures there. And Skull and Bones is at Yale University, which is in New Haven, Connecticut, if people don't know. Connecticut, for many years, was known as the arsenal of democracy. Why? Because more per capita defense spending was spent in Connecticut than any other state. Okay? The military-industrial complex started in Connecticut in the 1800s. Next slide. Opium Empire and the Global Political Economy. A very good book. If you want, you know, I wouldn't believe me. I mean, I'm just a hippie. This guy is a professor in Australia, and he's just nailed it completely. You know, and he talks about how the drug, and I would strongly, you know, if somebody wants to understand it, get that book. Next slide. Skull and Bones. They do all kinds of interesting things. This is the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court there is Morrison R. Waite. He's a member of the Order of Skull and Bones. And with 2 sentences and with no debate, he gave corporations the right of personhood. You know, I mean, they just bastardized the 14th Amendment. And that's things that, like Skull and Bones does. Next slide. Out of the same class that Morrison R. Waite came Dr. Benjamin Silliman, Jr. He's a member of the Order of Skull and Bones. He invented the crack distillation process and invented gasoline. He made the first petrochemicals from raw, what they called at that time, rock oil. Okay? And after he made gasoline and paraffin, he issued a report. And in his report he said, "Gentlemen, it appears to me that your company may have in their possession a raw material from which, by a simple and not expensive process, they may manufacture some very valuable products." Okay? Now, the Pennsylvania Rock, he got his sample from the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company. That was started by a Mr. Bissell, and he went to a Mr. Townsend for some financing. Well, after Silliman Jr. here issued his report, the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company, which was the first oil company, passed into the hands of investors from New Haven, Connecticut. And pretty soon, the Bissells and the Townsends had their sons in the Order of Skull and Bones. And the money from the oil company helped build Yale and helped build Skull and Bones. Next slide. This is Rudolf Diesel. Now, he wasn't a member of the Order of Skull and Bones. And he, you know, he was a very interesting guy. If you read about Rudolf Diesel, he didn't invent his engine just because he was a smart guy. He invented his engine because he had a social conscience. And he didn't want the farmers and everybody to be beholden to the monopoly. So he created the diesel engine. And at the 1900 exposition, he ran it on peanut oil. Okay? This is in the 1900s. And there's a big history of it. And yeah, he died in 1913. He was going across the English Channel and woke up with the fishes. And within 20 years, his engine was running just on petrochemicals. You know? And petrochemicals, you know, aren't just gasoline. You know, they're plastic and all other kinds of things. And make the medicine and whatnot. And it's done another reason why marijuana and hemp is illegal, because cannabis is a huge competitor of petrochemicals. We do not have to be awash in petrochemicals. And I know there are people that say that, you know, it's going to take too long for us to change. I don't believe that. We can change a lot faster, and we do not have to be addicted to oil. Next slide. Like I say, we're back here. What are we going to do? I truly think nothing is going to happen unless we do it. Okay? We can't sit around and wait for somebody to tell us what to do. Okay? It is going to change by us doing it. And we don't have to fight them with guns. The pen is mightier than the sword. Okay? The internet is an amazing tool. Okay? And people say, oh, well, they'll just shut it down. Well, it's not that simple. Okay? Our culture exceeds their conspiratorial designs. Okay? And we can beat them. Okay? The internet, the only thing that we have in the historical past like it is Gutenberg's press. And Gutenberg's press got rid of the oligarchy at that time, the Roman Catholic Church, which if you didn't believe what they said, you burned, and also brought us about our republic through the books that were developed and the thoughts that went back and forth. And us people are way much stronger than these people. The main tool that they have right now is the media. Okay? But look, with all of their power and with everything that they have, all the stuff they have behind them, the most that they can do is to get 2,500 people in a southern military town to say, oh, isn't George Bush great? Okay? But several 100,000 people marched impromptu in New York City. Okay? You go out on the internet, how many websites do you find that say, gosh, isn't George W. Bush dynamite? Isn't he groovy to have as our president? And 9/11, boy, you know, yeah, we ought to get behind. I mean, it's not out there, okay? Because people aren't buying what they're selling, okay? But one thing that people don't have is they don't have another place to go to get it, okay? There is the internet, and they can go to get there. They have tried to, you know, make the internet look bad and whatnot. But it is happening. We haven't even seen all the reverberations that the internet has already created. Okay? And what we need to do is just to bring it to a head, okay? And this isn't just happening in the United States. This is happening worldwide. And there is a change that happened. There's another book called Generations, which came out in the late 1990s. And what it talks about that there's 4 generations that go through history, and they nurture each other. And at a certain point in time, there is a big change that happens, and no matter who you are, what you are, you can't stop it. And these guys talked about in 1990 that this was going to happen in 2003, 2004, when that change was going to start. And it is started. And now is the time to come to the aid of your country. And we need to go out in the streets. Thank you.